Hi everybody and welcome to Heel Heat. My name is George Coles and on this episode we're doing a top 10. Topic of the top 10? Top 10 Heenan family members. Now if you're not familiar with the Heenan family, basically it is what Bobby the Brain Heenan called the people he managed through most of his career, whether that be in WWE or AWA or Georgia Championship Wrestling. So this is my look at what I consider the 10 best of that group. Now I will say a lot of people say the Heenan family is a faction, kind of like they do with Jimmy Hart and the First Family. I don't think they are. I think it's a little bit different. The times were different. I don't think we actually seen wrestling factions until we got to the Four Horsemen. Maybe the Freebirds before that, but I kind of feel they weren't even a faction. They were more of a tag team with an extra person. I digress. That's a different story, a different argument for a different day. Let's jump right into this one at number 10. The Masked Superstar, who Heenan managed in Georgia Championship Wrestling and won the Georgia Championship Wrestling Heavyweight Championship 4 times under Heenan's tutelage. Masked Superstar is one of those things that a lot of people don't really remember or don't remember how great he was, mostly because for the heavy majority of people that seen him, they seen him under a different gimmick, which is Acts of Demolition. But before that, he was a Masked Superstar, and he was one of the greats in Georgia Championship Wrestling, one of the guys in that very, very early Turner television to get on cable and become a star all across the United States while on there. Just a fantastic wrestler. Hence why he's on my list. I'll go from that, our number 9. A team that faced the Masked Superstar as X later on, the Brainbusters. Tully Blanchard and Arn Anderson. Now Blanchard and Anderson, they were only in WWE, I believe, a little bit over a year. It may have been right at a year. But during that time, they really set the bar high. Here we have 2 former Four Horsemen, 2 of the best wrestlers in the world. One of the greatest tag teams, in my opinion. When we talk about a purely in-ring, talent-wise, and we take away things like accolades, longevity, there's very few teams that can hold up to what the Brainbusters did. I mean, these were obviously 2 of the top 10 wrestlers in the world, any way you slice it, whether it be singles or tag. And it was kind of unfair to have them in tag team divisions. It was basically the equivalent of saying today, having Will Ospreay and AJ Styles form a tag team, and that tag team stay a team for like 3 years. The amount of accolades they would rack up would be impressive. This is a phenomenal team. I absolutely love them as the Brainbusters. I love them as the Horsemen. Just a great addition to the family. That's why they made my list. I'll go from that, our number 8. Blackjack Lanza. The first wrestler that Heenan managed in more than one company. He managed them both in GCW, which for the sake of this show is Georgia Championship Wrestling, not Game Changer Wrestling, and the AWA. In the AWA, he won a tag team championship with Bobby Duncum, who was another member of the Heenan family. Bobby Duncum Sr., you may mostly remember his son, Bobby Duncum Jr., if you're around my age. Blackjack Lanza is one of those guys that's kind of forgotten with time, much like the Masked Superstar gimmick. He did most of his work before there was a lot of videotape on him. He did a lot of his work in the 70s, and a lot of people think of him as part of the Blackjacks with Blackjack Mulligan, which, again, another fantastic team, one of the great teams and one of the storied teams of all time. But Lanza himself was a great wrestler, and didn't necessarily need to be tied to Blackjack Mulligan to have success. A guy that was so influential that I believe for 15, maybe 20 years he was an agent in WWE. I mean, that's a tough job and one that's hard to keep. You can get it, but do you stay there long? Just a phenomenal talent. Another example of a great wrestler being put with a great manager to make the package even that much better. Now, going from that, our number 7. A guy that I've heard didn't like to have Heenan as a manager because he didn't feel he needed a manager, and that's the ravishing one, Rick Rude. Rick Rude was under Heenan in the WWE, WWF, which if you're my age, you would definitely know that. He was the Intercontinental Champion while under Heenan's tutelage, and he was a constant upper card wrestler, whether that be against the Ultimate Warrior for both the World Championship and the IC Championship, or against Hulk Hogan. He's one of those guys that when people talk about people that didn't win a WWE Championship, they often bring him up as one of the guys that should have. Him, Piper, Scott Scott Hall as guys that are right there near the top that were so talented and so deserving of it, but just didn't get that opportunity. A lot of the reason is he came up in the Hulk Hogan era and the Ultimate Warrior era. If he would have came 10 years later when they switched the belts more often, he may have had a run or two with it. Ultimately he didn't, but he did have a ton of memorable moments, memorable feuds. Now going from that, our number 6. The first guy I remember being referred to as an Olympian, Ken Patera. And I know there were wrestlers that were Olympians before him. I'm talking about when I was personally watching. Much like Blackjack Lanza, Ken Patera was managed by Heenan in 2 different companies, first in the AWA and then in the WWE. He was an international champion while in the AWA under Heenan's tutelage. And he's one of those guys that was a huge star and an impressive wrestler that really needed that extra salt and pepper that Bobby Heenan brought to the steak. Guys like Rick Rude didn't necessarily need the Heenan rub to be a superstar. Rick Rude would have been at the same point in the card if he had no manager as he was with Heenan. It did make it better, of course, because Bobby Heenan makes everything better. Patera, on the other hand, Patera needed someone to convey how dangerous he was, how impressive he was, how technically skilled he was. Think of this, if you didn't see his career, which I know some of you didn't, think of this much like Paul Heyman and Brock Lesnar. Brock by himself was great. Probably would have reached the heights he did. You add Paul Heyman in to talk for him, and Brock Lesnar becomes one of the all-time greats. Similar trajectory with Ken Patera, with a similar skill set, if we're being honest. The thing that sticks out to Patera to me, and if you're of my age, you probably remember this. ESPN was a lot different channel back in the 1980s than it is now. It wasn't this polished pro sports all the time. They had some weird stuff on there. They had like strongman competitions and monster truck rallies and things that were different than just like baseball, football, hockey, soccer, basketball. And then there are countless hours of guys arguing about those sports. Back in the 80s, they pretty much put any sport they could get their hands on. And one of those things that I just mentioned was strongman competition. And you would watch Patera. For me, I was watching him in the WWE. I didn't see his AEW run till after this. You would see Patera, and then you'd see an old video from 4 or 5 years before that where he competed in one of the old strongman competitions. It was just cool seeing that little moment. Wrestling fans today are kind of used to wrestlers being ubiquitous, being everywhere. Guys like The Rock and John Cena are on everything. But back in the 80s, seeing a wrestler do something different, whether it be in a movie or in a sporting event or showing up somewhere like Saturday Night Live, was really a cool thing for wrestling fans. And that was one of those cool moments. I know I just went off on a tangent, but you had to be there, I guess. It was a different time. It was just really cool seeing. Now going from Ken Patera, our number 5, Mr. Perfect. Heenan managed Perfect in WWE to 2 Intercontinental Championships. And the thing that kind of surprises me is Bobby Heenan was never tied to Mr. Perfect, Curt Hennig's father, Larry the Axe Hennig, in the AWA in all the years he was there. It kind of felt like a no-brainer that he would have at some point managed Larry. However, he did manage his son, and he had a ton of success. Much like I said with Rick Rude, Curt Hennig, another one of those guys that's up there on the list of guys that should have won the WWE World Championship, but probably just was in the wrong era. I mean, a guy like Curt Hennig today would be like Seth Rollins is. He would get rewarded for his excellence. One of the great wrestlers of the late 80s, early 90s, a guy that absolutely lived up to his name. He was almost perfect in the ring. Fantastic wrestler. That's why he's on my list. Now going from that, our number 4. This is a guy that Bobby Heenan kind of co-managed with Mr. Perfect, and that's the Nature Boy. Woo! Ric Flair. Flair came into the WWE as a real world champion, holding the big gold belt, the NWA championship of the time, after a dispute with Jim Herd in WCW, and immediately latched himself on to Bobby the Brain Heenan, joined with Bobby Heenan, which again was kind of a no-brainer. Heenan and Flair went together like peanut butter and jelly. Heenan took what J.J. Dillon, who's a fantastic manager in his own right, took what J.J. had done with the Horsemen and added his Bobby Heenan flavoring to it and made Ric Flair, to the people that may not have known him and may not have read different wrestling magazines or ever seen WCW or Jim Crockett promotions, to the people that didn't know him, they knew he was special because he was with Bobby Heenan. Flair would go on to have 2 WWE championship runs during his time with Heenan. Much like the Brainbusters, this was a short run, but it was a great run. Probably one of the best times of Ric Flair's career as far as accomplishment-wise. The only thing that was missing from this run was that signature Hulk Hogan-Ric Flair match that we should have got. We should have got at WrestleMania, I think it was 7 or 8, whatever year that was, I think it was 7. Instead of Hogan versus Sid and Savage versus Flair, we should have got Hogan versus Flair. And actually it was 8 now that I think about it. But I digress. Ric Flair, one of the greats of all time, definitely deserves to be on the list. I'll go from that on number 3, the Crippler Ray Stevens. Heenan managed the Crippler in the AWA to 4 tag team championships while under his tutelage, largely considered by wrestling fans that were a generation ahead of me to be one of the great wrestlers of his generation. And a lot of people say to me the greatest tag team they ever saw that are a little bit older than me would have been Bockwinkel and Stevens. From the little bits that I've seen of Ray Stevens and the tons that I've read and have heard of him, he was just an amazing wrestler. I mean, there was nothing that this guy couldn't do. And yeah, it may be different, and yes, if you watch it now, he's not doing suicide dives or Heenan Karanas. His style may look a little bit slower than what we're used to, but for the time, he was one of the most innovative wrestlers and one of the most imitated wrestlers. Guys like Ric Flair would copy things from Ray Stevens because Ray Stevens was just that good. One of the guys that really laid the foundation and the groundwork for what pro wrestling would become and how big it would become as a sport. Just an amazing wrestler. Definitely deserves to be on our list. I'm going from that on number 2. The 8th wonder of the world, Andre the Giant. Heenan obviously managed Andre during his WWF run. He managed him to a tag team championship with Haku, and with a big asterisk, he managed him to a world championship, which Andre immediately gave to the Ted DiBiase, which at the time, that win was nullified and the belt was put up for grabs. However, WWE, seemingly, depending on the story, this is either in their record books or out of their record books, and it goes back and forth. I never really counted it because when it happened, they didn't count it, so it's weird to see it being added to record books as a championship reign. That's why I said there's a big asterisk to it. With that being said, Andre the Giant turning heel and joining with Bobby Heenan to try and end Hulkamania, that was a moment that took what Hogan and Piper had built with the MTV connection, with WrestleMania 1 and 2, with the whole rock and wrestling era. They took that, and it would be basically like having a little bit of a fire in a field and then dropping 5 gallons of gasoline on it, because Andre the Giant created what has to be one of the biggest matches in the history of wrestling. And a lot's been said about the attendance, whether it was a real number, a fake number, whatever it may be. The fact that we're here 35 years later talking about Hulk Hogan and Andre the Giant still tells you how important that is. It tells you how high they set the bar. And yes, Andre was on the tail end of his career, and he wasn't anything near as mobile or impressive as he was 5 to 10 years earlier than this. For everything it meant, that feud, that rivalry, the last great run of one of the great talents in wrestling history, that's why he made it so high on our list. Now, before I get to my number 1 here, we do a thing here on my top 10s called the best of the rest. Basically, these were things that were considered for the list but didn't quite make it. First up, Haku. We just talked about Andre the Giant winning a tag team championship. His partner, Haku. It felt like Haku was a mainstay in the Heenan family for several years, whether it be with the Islanders, the Colossal Connection, the King Haku run. He kind of felt like the Arn Anderson of the group, if we're going to compare it to a faction. Here again was a guy, much like I said with Patera, that needed a mouthpiece to talk to him, to talk for him, but didn't need anything when you put him in the ring, because anybody will tell you Haku is one of the most dangerous men to ever compete in the sport. One of my favorites of the era, one of the guys I really look back and look fondly upon. Haku was just amazing, hence why he was considered for the list. Last but not least on the best of the rest, success. The only guy on this entire list that didn't win a championship while under Heenan's tutelage, Mr. Wonderful Paul Orndorff. Orndorff, much like Andre the Giant, turned his back on Hulk Hogan to join up with Heenan, and the sheer fact that he's in here with all these legendary wrestlers that had multiple championship runs, highlight reel matches, and was considered over several other wrestlers that fit that bill as well, was the impact of Paul Orndorff's turn on Hulk Hogan. A lot of people look back and they look at the Andre turn, and they look at feuds with Hogan and Warrior, or Hogan and Savage, or Hogan and Piper as defining moments in the Hogan run, but I would argue that Paul Orndorff is right up there. Here you had a guy that was just as big as Hogan. You could argue had a better body than Hogan, looked better than Hogan, was faster than Hogan, was more dangerous than Hogan. He gave Hulk Hogan a different kind of foe, whereas Bundy was someone that was just bigger than Hogan, and Hogan could outsmart him and outquick him, or Andre, same thing, or Piper was based off of how much outside interference and dirty tactics he would use. Orndorff was a guy that felt like he was on equal footing with Hulk Hogan. That's why he was considered for the list, but didn't quite make. And before I do get to my number one, let's smash that like button, share the video, subscribe if you haven't. If you made it this far, I'm assuming you like this. Either that, or you hate everything I'm saying and you're waiting to see how stupid the number one is. But if you do, let's smash that like button. Give me a like for giving you however many minutes of entertainment this has been so far. That being said, our number one Heenan family member, Nick Bockwinkel. Bobby Heenan managed Bockwinkel in the AWA. He managed him to 4 tag team championships with Ray Stevens, 4 world championships on his own, and also an AWA Southern Heavyweight Championship, which, if you're not familiar, that's the same belt that Jerry Lawler would wrestle for in the CWA/USWA. So that was their big belt. They had a loose relationship at times with the AWA, where the AWA champion would come in, or AWA stalwarts would come into the company, Bockwinkel being one of them. Nick Bockwinkel, to me, and I've said this about a couple people, is kind of forgotten with time. And what I mean by that is a lot of people may have heard the name or may have heard stories about him, but he's not talked about with the reverence of his contemporaries. Like, he's not brought up like Harley Race is, or Bruno Sammartino, or even Ric Flair. He's kind of thought of as the old school guy that won championships way back when, all the way to the late 80s. Everything that Harley Race was in the NWA, Nick Bockwinkel was in the AWA. Everything that Bruno Sammartino was for WWF at the time, Bockwinkel was for the AWA. He was their symbol of excellence. And whether you want to look at the AWA as the 3rd biggest company in the country at the time, or the 2nd, or one of the 3 big companies, I would say you could argue NWA was the biggest of the Bockwinkel era, except for the tail end, specifically during his run with Heenan. NWA was the biggest company worldwide and through the United States. Then you have WWF, their territory, the Northeast, and AWA, their territory, which included everything from Chicago to San Francisco. I would say it was almost on equal footing. The reason the AWA isn't brought up as much, the WWE won the war. The winner gets to write the history. They're not giving us 40 videos on the great wrestlers of the AWA. We got 1, maybe 2 compilation DVDs, much like with Mid-South Wrestling or even WCW, but they did milk WCW a little bit. I will give them that. Another reason, there's not a ton of film on it. There's stuff from the 80s when he was obviously later in his career and the style was starting to change. Another reason, Nick Bockwinkel's even a little bit before my time. At the time of this recording, I'm 46 years old, so the people that would have seen Bockwinkel at the height of his prime are 50 years old plus. So how many of those people are still around? How many of those people are still caring and talking about wrestling? There's not too many, but he was absolutely that guy. I mean, when I go back and I watch a Nick Bockwinkel highlight, a match, I marvel at just how good he is and how great of a talent he was. For the length that he did it, the amount of accolades, that's why I consider Nick Bockwinkel the greatest member of the Bobby Heenan family. With that being said, if you think I put someone too high, left someone too low, left somebody off the list altogether, let me know down here in the comments. If you made it here to the end, let me know who your favorite Bobby Heenan family member is. It doesn't have to be the best one, the most accomplished one. Just your favorite. If it's the Barbarian, if it's Brooklyn Brawler, if it's a missing link, let me know what you think down here. With all that being said, my name is George Coles, and this has been another Top 10.